Hey guys and girls, this is Cam Byrne and welcome to the Fistbump Podcast. Today we've got Chris Shen on the podcast. So I first met Chris as a white belt at my first Brazilian Jiu Jitsu academy, where he made an immediate impact on his first seminar that I attended. Chris is a head wrestling coach at invitation-only Team Takedown. He's a psychologist and author of the book Wrestling with Resilience, a handbook for developing resilience and mental toughness, a tackling coach for various AFL clubs, and has refereed and judged multiple high-profile MMA events, including the UFC. Apart from those accolades, he's just an amazing human being. He's got a huge focus on creating a strong mental focus in everything that you do. So I guarantee you'll find a few gems in this one. So let me know what you think. All right, so we're here with Chris Shen. How are you, Chris?
Cam, I'm outstanding. How are you, sir?
Very, very good. So I suppose just to kind of give a bit of background for everyone who maybe doesn't know who you are, I think this will probably go to a lot of Australian Jiu-Jitsu people, MMA people, wrestlers, judo. But for those that don't, maybe they're interstate or they haven't actually met you, give us a bit of background about who you are.
Thank you. I am firstly delighted to be a guest, so thank you very much. I believe that the most accurate description is I'm a mixed martial artist. I started my martial arts journey many years ago when I was 4, initially starting with judo, continued that through in the 1970s and 1980s with karate, and then discovered Brazilian Jiu Jitsu and wrestling when I was in my early 20s. Leaping a long way forward to 2018, I'm the head wrestling coach at Team Takedown Wrestling in Melbourne. I'm also the tackling coach with the Northern Knights in the AFL's Under-18 TAC Cup Elite Pathway program. And furthermore, I officiate in the sport of mixed martial arts for both Australian state and territory organisations and also for overseas bodies as well.
Fantastic. You've actually pretty much almost read every bullet point that I had to talk about. So that's perfect. It's great. I suppose take us back in terms of when you were younger as a kid. I wasn't aware that you'd done so much stuff around through other martial arts. Mm-hmm. So you're a lifelong martial artist, not just a wrestler. And I know that I was going to talk about it separately. You're a brown belt in Brazilian Jiu Jitsu,
indeed.
And I suppose it's probably not for lack of trying that it's for lack of attention to Brazilian Jiu Jitsu because you've been primarily focused on the wrestling side of things. Would that be correct?
That's accurate, yeah.
And as a kid, just to kind of take away all the martial arts side, what were you like as a kid? Was there something in particular that prompted you to start martial arts, like a bullying experience?
Thank you. That's a great question. No, it was...
Were you the nerdy kid?
No, in fact, it was less... in those halcyon memories, it was less about the bullying and more about being proactive. And what do I mean there, Cam, is that my parents and my older brother, we all lived in regional Victoria in a regional town called Traralgon, and at one point in the 1970s we were the only Asian family in the entire Latrobe Valley region, and what that meant is we stood out. And my father was the chief pharmacist of the local government hospital, and he identified really, really quickly when my older brother Albert and I were born that it would be helpful for us to learn martial arts because we were different, yet also for confidence and developing some interests and passions, so we were less likely to be bullied or led into drugs, that sort of thing. And I'm delighted to attest that our father's aspirations have delightfully been met in both my brother and my lifelong pursuit of martial arts.
It's very interesting you should say that, because I would say that I went to high school, Campbell Grammar, where it was compulsory to do sports, and I never did a day of sports. I told cricket that I was in hockey that I was in cricket, and somehow got lost in the system. And from about 12 to 18, I'd say the lack of direction or the lack of a hobby. I wasn't still a gamer, and I kind of found other hobbies to go down. But it was really when I started finding boxing, going to the gym, Muay Thai, Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, all that side of the martial arts stuff that it actually gave me a bit of focus in my life, I'd say. And I'd say, even though it wasn't a mindful choice not to go out as much, when you've got training the next day, you don't want to go out as much. So it wasn't something where I was like, I should direct my attention towards martial art. It was sort of more like, I can't be hungover tomorrow.
The pursuit of the martial arts itself dissuade you from going
Correct.
out.
Yeah. And it's one of those character building things, I suppose, and I'd like your opinion on this. Like, it's one of the things that can't be bought. It's something where if you don't put in the time, you don't get better. If you're in an uncomfortable situation, you can't get out of it. You have to kind of work your way through cerebrally, particularly in wrestling and Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. And it's one of those things that you can't. You could throw $1 million at someone. You can't get a black belt or anything like that without putting in the hard work.
Absolutely.
I know there's obviously no belt system in wrestling, but the anecdote still kind of.
No, here. In fact, the anecdote is a particularly salient one. Let me just fist bump you.
Yeah.
Kaboom! Outstanding. That's more of a visual joke.
That's all right. We'll get the photo later.
In as much as throughout my early years and teens, I studied karate. One very good reason why it was karate as the martial art was living in regional Traralgon. That was the major martial art that was on offer, as well as just the Olympic judo. It was only later on when I came to a larger city, which is Melbourne, to study at university, that all of the plethora of options of different martial arts presented themselves. And not at the time yet, I'm a psychologist professionally, reflecting back, what appealed to me very much about Brazilian Jiu Jitsu and concurrently wrestling is the legitimacy of those combat sports, Cam, that, as you attested earlier, certainly way back in 1992 when I started Brazilian Jiu Jitsu and shortly thereafter when I started wrestling, there was no fraud about those combat sports. The only way that you would develop competency would be from copious hours and hours of exacting practice and rep after rep and hitting the mats and all that. And that was a real source of pride and achievement, not just by myself yet, for any exponent. And I believe really sets wrestling, which is often self-described by exponents as one of the world's hardest sports, and also Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as some of the most toughest sports in which to achieve. And
I've spoken to Trent about this just recently, about when you go into a jiu-jitsu class, you might have kind of the nerdy person that's like either a gamer or something like that, and the cerebral part of jiu-jitsu is what attracts them to it. I used to be about 10 kilos lighter than I am at the moment, and not able to use strength, so Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was a huge attraction. But when you have someone coming over from wrestling, when they've got the focus and the physical attributes and the athleticism and the hard mindset, it makes for a very, at least from a jiu-jitsu perspective, it makes you think, oh man, I don't want to roll against Trent again. He's just going to squash me and, destroy my soul, basically. And I will touch on, I think the first time when you met Brian Hurley, I think the first time I met you, you actually told me how you guys met at a competition.
Absolutely.
So we'll go into that, because that's one of my favourite anecdotes that you said.
Thank you. I agree wholeheartedly. And of course, for your listeners, we're referring to my assistant coach and lifelong friend, Trent Teethens.
Yes, exactly. And I suppose it's probably come across a little bit in this podcast anyway. You're a very respectful and well-spoken person.
Thank you.
So it's very weird that you could probably turn a lot of people into human pretzels, I'd say. And just taking me back to, I started jiu-jitsu maybe about 7.5 years ago or so, and I think about 3 or 4 months in, you came over and did a seminar at Perkins in Ringwood at the time.
What year would that have been, Cam?
That would have been 2014. And even then, the speech that you gave at the end about holding your fist when you're about to go into a competition, and the kind of self-talk that you kind of talk about, which is obviously from your psychology background, made such a huge impact. And especially as a white belt, going for 3 months, and I think I entered my first competition a month later and tried to keep that mental focus that you were saying. And I saw lots of the other white belts who were there doing the same thing. It's incredible. My
pleasure, and there's many reasons why I'm delighted to do this podcast. The most compelling when you invited me is our long-standing history when I first met you at Dion's.
Yeah. So, also, from my understanding, you're I don't know, it's not obviously a lineage or a belt system, but Eric Paulson, I believe, is your wrestling coach. Is that correct?
Thank you so much. Coach Eric Paulson is my submission wrestling coach or catch wrestling coach.
And do you in the same way that there are different grappling styles, there's obviously different wrestling styles, do you do Greco-Roman, freestyle,
Correct.
All the different types?
Yep. Let me pay service to my lineage, to my coaches. My coach in catch wrestling and submission wrestling, which is primarily what Team Takedown teaches. We teach three of the United World Wrestling sports, the two Olympic sports of freestyle and Greco-Roman wrestling, and grappling, which is essentially catch wrestling or submission wrestling. So Coach Eric Pawson, who my brother and I have been delighted to have been students of since, so that's grammatical, since 20 years ago in about 1999. So that's Coach Eric Pawson. My wrestling coach was Chris Brown, Australia's greatest ever wrestler, 5-time Olympian, and also won the US Open as an Australian, which is an outstanding historical accomplishment. My Brazilian Jiu Jitsu coaches have included John Will, John Donahue, and more recently I've been lucky enough to cross-train with my students who include Coach Mick Wilson and Coach Brian Hurley, who you mentioned earlier, and others. And interestingly enough, we're actually recording this at Team Takedown at the moment, and the vast majority of my students who I started coaching in wrestling when they were white belts in judo, or black jiu-jitsu, or black belts in jiu-jitsu now.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, you've got, just for those that don't know, we've probably got about 8 or so people working in the background, which is probably hear the thuds on the ground in the background. I suppose let's take the conversation there in terms of Team Takedown. So how it started, obviously it's invitation only. How do you, I suppose, interview or get the right people in here?
Yeah, select.
Yeah, please give me a bit of information about that.
Thank you. Team Takedown, we just celebrated our 12th year.
12 years?
As a club. So we started that way back in, to take 12 years. I'm a psychologist, not a mathematician. What's that? 2006.
Yes.
And that arose, I had been training and coaching at another jiu-jitsu and mixed martial arts academy, and then in 2006 had always wanted to start my own martial art club, and I'd had invitations over the years, or requests I should say, from students and so forth, and I was also trying to qualify for the Beijing Olympic Games in freestyle wrestling. And so I invited my brother, Albert, my lifelong training partner, Trent Thiesens, one of my training partners and a good friend, and also Mark Mandel, who is another one of my training partners and a lifelong student who's now living in San Francisco, works for Google, amazingly. And we all started getting together once a week on a Saturday, essentially to help me prepare for the Olympic trials for the Beijing Olympics.
Sorry, this was back in 2006,
2006,
you said? Okay,
correct.
so you were preparing for 2008?
Correct.
Gotcha.
And then what happened was, as particularly back then, yet even now, the grappling community in Victoria is quite a small one.
Yeah.
People started hearing that we were training, and we were training at a really, really hard level. Others started asking if they could come down as well, and I was reluctant because the purpose was to train hard and not actually to instruct.
Yes.
However, I received quite a few compelling invitations or requests, I should say, and so I decided to impose a selection process. And that is, to this day, that I endeavour to select candidates for Team Takedown based on two broad qualities, Cam. The first is around character as a human being. What are their principles, what are their ethics? I won't take anybody who's been convicted of a criminal offence.
Yes.
Or is engaged in dubious behaviours, that sort of thing. And I've expelled students in the past as well for that. And the second broad set of attributes is around them as an athlete. How hard do they train? How conscientious are they? What's their degree of safety towards other team members? And I've expelled students as well who have been unsafe as training partners, particularly in sports like wrestling and catch wrestling. And Team Takedown evolved from there. At one point in time, we were very much a competition team, where even though I don't require this of our team members, I always provide opportunities for team members to compete in wrestling competitions, and then I'll help coach them for their jiu-jitsu or mixed martial arts events as well. At one point in time in approximately 2006 to about 2012, our team, which at its greatest was about 25,
wow,
and now is about 13 or 14. At its peak, we had about 9 professional mixed martial art fighters, including Kenny Young and Dennis Kelly, Brandon Summers, and Phil Lay and David Weston. And I would help prepare them not just in wrestling, but I'd also help prepare them in chaining, their striking training, which they would do elsewhere, to the wrestling, which I would coach them in, to the groundwork, which they would learn elsewhere as well. So I would coach them both to the wrestling, the chaining from stage to stage to stage, Cam, and also help them with the psychology.
And I suppose that leads into a very interesting area as well, because even though it's a very restricted group that you have here in terms of the numbers here, which by the way is actually very, I'd say that's very, not notable, but respectful as well, because it's not for profitability purposes. It's literally,
in fact, we're not
it's
for
self-restricted.
profit. Absolutely,
it's basically you guys saying we're only going to train the best because we want to have the best. That's basically it. That's our criteria, at best, both from a character perspective and also.
And thank you for that late clarification, because with reference to my earlier historical observation and reflection, we've now progressed, particularly over the last 2 seasons, where I've been heavily involved with AFL footy, that we are now more of a... we still have competitors, so Chantel Thompson, a multiple world Brazilian Jiu Jitsu champion, and also... Sorry, I've gone blank from home. I just need to really just look over it.
Make sure he's there.
Whilst we've got active competitors, we also have a focus on people becoming better human beings through the diligent practice of wrestling.
I suppose just taking you back to earlier on in that conversation as well, when you were talking about the fact that you're training different their striking and submission skills into their wrestling stuff, that's where I wanted to take it in terms of AFL as a really, it's obviously an Australian sport. How do you adapt the wrestling that you know from a traditional wrestling background to AFL? How do you do it from an MMA perspective? Obviously, you've got the martial arts background in some aspect. You kind of consult with the existing coaches. Like you'd say, Mark Hammer, you're a Muay Thai coach. What are you getting him to focus on? And then you kind of chain it together that way? Or is it very independent in terms of what you yourself and the other coaches?
Thank you. My response to your very wise question about how to collaborate and work in cohesion with specialist coaches in mixed martial arts is a historical one, because I'm no longer coaching for mixed martial arts, because as my MMA officiating became more and more prominent, I've withdrawn. So I no longer coach MMA competitors because of a conflict of interest. So I never wanted to place myself or my athlete or a promotion or a governing body in a difficult position because I was officiating one of my athletes. Yet in answering a very good question, way back between 2006 and 2012 or so, what I would do is I would introduce myself to the specialist coaches, the MMA, the striking coach, perhaps the MMA coach if they had one as well, and the Brazilian Jiu Jitsu coach. I would invite the coaches to Team Takedown to not only meet, yet also to see how I train their and our valued athlete in wrestling. And I would also seek to visit them and ask as many questions as I could about their approach to their particular specialist sport. And then I would endeavour to chain them all together. And I was... and continue to be lucky enough to have the overarching orientation of Coach Eric Paulson's combat submission wrestling and catch wrestling, where he's a world-leading exponent of being able to blend them all. And then it was delightfully trial and error, and one of the things I love, Cam, about coaching tackling in Aussie rules football, and I've been doing this for some time. I started way back with the Western Bulldogs in 2007, and to be invited by the Northern Knights 2 seasons ago, in the intervening 10 years, I've had a lot of learning, and so I'm doing a little bit differently. I'm much more respectful to the specialist line coaches, the beautiful coach, defensive coach, the forwards coach and the head coach, to ask what they want, and then to try to accommodate my wrestling to them, which is why in 2018 I'm listed as the psychologist and tackling coach. Whereas back in 2007, I was the wrestling coach. So I actually used to define myself as the wrestling coach. Well, I'm the specialist, I'm here to give you wrestling knowledge. Whereas 10 years later, I'm much more humble and recognise, well, this isn't my sport, it's Aussie rules footy. How do I accommodate the wrestling attributes and knowledge for you as a tackling coach?
So for clubs that don't have a wrestling coach, they're still tackling coaches, and what's their background typically? Is it just they've played a lot of footy and they...
That's a good question. Primarily influenced by budgetary requirements. The vast majority of footy clubs within the elite system would have a consultant tackling coach, someone like a Coach John Donahue, for example. Coach Malcolm Banks as well, and myself. Underneath that, the VFL clubs in Victoria or the other state and territory-based clubs most likely will be using an ex-player as a coach who is coaching the tackling skills that he developed during his career, that sort of thing.
It's very interesting as well, though, because the pace of a wrestling match versus an AFL match is very different in that a wrestling match is a bit more paced. You can kind of square up with the person, you're controlling them. It's not a cardio thing where you're going to be chasing someone down like a lion and gazelle and trying to wrap around them and pull them down as hard as possible. Was that a little bit of a switch for you in terms of the pace of what like a footy player would be doing as opposed to a wrestler?
Absolutely. The 360-degree nature of footy, that you can tackle or be tackled from a 360-degree from any position, any angle, immediately puts it at odds with most combat sports.
And by multiple people as well.
Absolutely. Plus, it's not your sole intention to take the other person down. You want to win the football and so forth, or guard, or whatever it may be. So very, very complex. And just reflecting with you in this really nice conversation here, Cam, it wasn't that I deliberately omitted that when I first was asked by the Western Bulldogs to get involved. It's that I didn't appreciate that. It's only years and years and years of being involved and chat and really humbling myself to recognise that, okay, I'm a servant of this new sport, football. I've got a high degree of expertise and knowledge, yet that's not helpful to anybody unless I listen and endeavour to accommodate their needs, not impose.
It's almost like listening to the context of their sport, but with the expertise of your sport. It's almost like you have to understand that, yes, a takedown would be beneficial, but not when it's at the risk of not having ball control or
giving away free.
Exactly.
I can't teach a standard double leg because in footy, if the hand's straight below the knees, it's a free kick. And of course, what players will do, and the Geelong captain Selwood is renowned for this, is he'll earn a free kick because as the person's going to tackle him, he'll drop his level and he'll lift his arm up, and so the tackling arm will come up and hit him in the head and he'll get the free.
And then he goes, I've got high.
So then
not as bad as soccer players.
No. And so then it's about, okay, well, how do we adapt the technique to overcome his countermeasure, which is a very good countermeasure.
I'd never even thought of that. I'm not much of an AFL fan in terms of I don't watch it every week or anything like that, but I didn't even think of the fact of someone manipulating the rules to the point where making it look like it's a high tackle.
Doing it superbly, to the degree that one of our specialist coaches and long-standing servant of the AFL, Brent Harvey, played the AFL games record, and our best and fairest at the Northern Nights is named after him. I have been lucky enough to spend a bit of time with him and asking him what he's seen, learned and experienced over his incredible journey in AFL football, and he taught that to me. And then he actually said, okay, try to tackle me, Shenny, and I tried to tackle him numerous times, and I couldn't not give the free kick. The way I was teaching it at the start of the season, last season. And so that forced me to acknowledge the ingenuity of Selwood's countermeasure
Yeah.
and adapt counters to his countermeasure.
It's very interesting.
Yeah.
I've never thought about it at all.
Yeah.
There you go. Do you think that all the elite AFL players follow a similar kind of philosophy around that?
I would say yes, because everybody's trying to be the best they can be.
Yeah.
The interesting laboratory that we can all observe is AFLWs as women's football.
Yes.
Because what we actually have there is a new nascent elite environment, only 2 seasons old, where they've got the combines on at the moment. Just this past week, as we're recording this, where we've got the top elite female players from the under-18 pathway systems. Also, there's code hoppers.
Yep.
Charlie Layton from netball, the champion Australian representative, is now being drafted by Collingwood. And to actually see, well, how do they pick up tackling and countermeasures to tackling?
It's very interesting as well, and this is a bit of a random tangent to go on, but as you were just saying that about the women's AFL, one of my friends is actually one of the world champions for Quidditch. So having a broomstick in between your legs. I know it seems very weird to people that haven't seen it. So Taya Rawson, shout out to her. But she took me down to a training because she knew that I was doing Brazilian Jiu Jitsu and said, is there anything you can teach that would actually be able to help us with our tackling with that? But keeping in mind that you always have to have one hand on the broomstick in the middle of your legs. So it's very difficult to then be able to adapt that to like a double leg takedown.
Of course.
Or to be able to still control the person with a single arm. So I was teaching sort of almost like a duck under type control with a single arm wrapped around and pulling them down, but it's very, very hard to be able to adapt the technique from one sport to the...
A commendable shout out to your friends there. What was her name?
Taya Rawson.
Congratulations to Taya Rawson.
Yes. Last year world champion.
Outstanding accomplishment. What I will say is that that's what I absolutely love about coaching tackling in Aussie rules is the creativity that's invoked. I can't just apply wrestling. I certainly can't apply Brazilian Jiu Jitsu and catch wrestling. So how do I adapt the knowledge that I have and create and be flexible with the techniques and the drills, and then respond as I had to this season. So during this season, I had to adjust the technique I was teaching our players because of different emphases with the AFL's tribunal, where they'd suspended some players for head high or for slinging.
Their interpretation of the rules.
And so then that flows down immediately to the AFL's pathway program. So then it was beholden on me, Cam, to modify as we were going through the season. And I love that. I actually love the challenge. Whilst I always enjoy teaching and instructing, I especially enjoy being creative. If I've got a choice, I'd love to teach everybody, yet if I've got a choice, give me high graded black belts. Give me experienced people. Give me elite juniors who are eager to learn, and I love working with that group.
Can I actually ask as well, because of my unfamiliarity with wrestling, is there anything off limits in terms of, like, there's obviously in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu heel hooks traditionally in like a white belt, blue belt, purple belt, even up to black belt, heel hooks are illegal. Wrist locks on the available blue belt, calf slices, leg locks.
So as you progress through the grades, there's certain limitations that are released. Now in wrestling, this is one of the things I loved about wrestling. The moment you step onto the mat, in your very first match as a beginner, you could be up against a 5-time Olympian.
Yes.
And all the rules apply. There are no concessions for being a beginner, which I love, because I love the opportunity when I was competing, Cam, to test myself against the best. Whereas it used to frustrate me a little bit in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu way back in the early 1990s and 2000s when I was training and competing in BJJ. In Australia, the vast majority of people were clustered around the blue belt, so I got to compete against the blue belts. Yet, if I was starting Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu now as a white belt, without
knowing what you know,
correct,
it
might be a little bit frustrating. So I always enjoyed in grappling competitions like the ADCC submission grappling world championships, where you pretty much got to do anything and everything within their rule set at all at all divisions.
And this is not a knock on the traditional Brazilian Jiu Jitsu system. Like when I was down at Perkins Jiu Jitsu, we followed the IBJJF recommended rule set. But when I came to Gracie Jiu Jitsu Burwood, they've got open. You can do heel hooks,
because it's a martial art oriented emphasis.
But it's very interesting because without having the exposure previously, to then go to a club where even the white belts have been learning heel hooks.
Do you have hesitation?
No, not really. I think it's as long as you have a controlled submission. I think it's the same thing that you were saying in terms of the intent of the person who's wrestling, and if they're being too harsh or too tough.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, all we have to do, and I know that the viewers can't, the listeners can't see this. All you have to do is look over at our mat now, where my assistant coaches are teaching something that would, in other environments, be quite complex and quite potentially dangerous. Yet, if you progressively build up an environment where everybody is safe, they all know how to fall, you create an actual lawfully safe environment, then of course you can do that.
And even a culture.
Oh yeah, here. I'm so fist bump, kaboom! I'm so pleased that you raised culture because, as a coach, especially as a psychologist, to me it's so important to endeavour to create a good culture for your martial art. And what is culture? Culture is the way we act and treat others, and so that shows itself in behaviours.
Yes. I was just going to say,
in all of those ways that we interact with one another, and I've endeavoured to set and sustain a culture where we're respectful to each and everyone else, and I've been really pleased over the journey with Team Takedown, Cam, that all of my members have adopted that as well.
And I think you can see it in the quality of the people that you've got here. And when I say quality, I don't mean athletic. Sure. I mean their behaviours. Yeah. Because hardworking, leadership, good people. You said about the certain rules about any kind of criminal record or anything like that. I think it's great. It's fantastic. It develops that culture. If you're surrounded by people who also have that good culture as well, it just feeds on itself and creates a beautiful culture.
Absolutely. And whilst examples can be found of elite achievers in many domains who turn out to be unlawful or poor human beings, for example, the way that they treat and act towards others. Over my long journey as a coach and as a psychologist, high achievement, I believe, is enhanced by good character.
Yeah. I suppose on this, I'll ask one more question, just MMA, UFC related, and then I think I want to go down the route of your book.
Thank you.
So, in terms of your capacity as a UFC judge and referee, can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I think previously on Facebook, the first time that I saw you just backstage with the UFC pass, and I thought, wow, that's great. He's obviously got connections. And then I saw you in the ring refereeing, one of the UFC events. I think it was also AFC you were a part of as well.
Yeah. Thank you. I've been enormously privileged to, I would say serendipitously initially, and then more recently, based on my competence and skill set, to be involved with the growth of mixed martial arts as an official in Australia and in the Asian region. I've been extremely privileged. I was lucky enough to be involved with some of the first mixed martial arts bouts in the state of Victoria, where the combat sports unit approached myself and some other pioneers to help put together a rule set for this growing sport of, at that stage, no holds barred, vale tudo, whatever it may have been called colloquially in grappling circles, and to make it a lawful, safe, compliant activity. And so way back in 2006, I refereed one of the first professional MMA bouts in Victoria. There were some bouts held earlier that the coach John Donoghue had organised, yet this was one of the first ones under a rule set that the Department of Sport and Recreation had established, and was heavily involved, refereed and judged hundreds of bouts over the following years. And then I was lucky enough to be invited to officiate the very first Australian fighting championship event in 2010. I believe it was October, November 2010 in Melbourne, where the organisers had really spared no measure in creating this professional environment. We had to use a ring at that stage because a cage was not lawful up until I think approximately 2014 in Victoria, and I'm lucky enough to have refereed the very first cage bout as well in Victoria. That was not only a great event, that AFC event. I also then met an official who would go on to change the direction of my career in a positive way, which was Steve Percival. And Steve Percival, who's a jiu-jitsu coach, a black belt in Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, also a long-standing Hapkido master, was my co-referee for this event. And he had an involvement with the UFC. He invited me to become involved officiating in Tasmania's first professional mixed martial arts match with his team, and then he endorsed me to the Ultimate Fighting Championship, and I was lucky enough then to become involved initially backstage as a fight room inspector, and then in 2015 I was asked to become a judge for their event in Adelaide, and I've continued to judge in Asia for the UFC ever since.
And also with 1FC?
One FC was another event which is tremendously successful in Asia. I've not officiated in 1FC, yet several of my students have in the past competed.
And I believe, trust me, I scoured the internet for this. You've also had some MMA fights as well. Was it 3?
4. Thank you for asking. 4 amateur events. I'm a C-class shooter, if that means anything to you, which is that under the Shuto, the Japanese shoot fighting organisation. No, it's called Shuto, SHOOTO. So under the Japanese shoot fighting organisation, I'm considered a C-class shooter, which is an amateur fighter. Then they've got professionals B and A. So 2 wins, 2 losses. Both my losses to guillotines as I was shooting in.
You're kidding me.
And I barely got struck because my whole game plan back in 2003 or so was the moment I touched gloves, I shot. So 3 rounds, these events were, all I needed was 3 shots. 3 shots, take the person down.
I think that is actually the first thing that you said to us at Perkins Jiu-Jitsu, slap hands and go for the takedown.
Yeah, absolutely.
And just saying, it's not like, even though it might sound like it's not the right thing to do, it is completely with the rule set. The rules are that you want to try and beat the other person, go for it. Tap hands.
And thank you. Now, bear in mind that was 2003,
yes.
Cam. And so even back then, I got scouted, and the coaches of the 2 opponents who beat me, it was in the second round of both, realised that's what I was doing. I wasn't hard to watch me to realise this guy's a wrestler, he's in the national wrestling team, he's going to shoot. And so they just prepared to get it, and that's how I got it, which was great because tapped. Great, I'm unmarked.
Yeah, that's
fantastic.
Right. Exactly.
I'm going to retire and go back to wrestling. Because for me, I always wanted to have a crack at MMA and then return to wrestling.
So, are there any videos online of it? Because I looked everywhere. You do have a Sherdog profile, but I can't find anything.
I think I'm lucky enough to have bypassed the YouTube phenomenon back then. However, I'm almost certain these events were filmed.
Yeah.
I'm certain somebody like...
there'll be an unnamed video file somewhere with you in there.
Correct.
That's awesome.
Thank you.
All right, so we just took a bit of a break just so Chris could just get a few rounds in. And just,
pardon my heavy breathing.
I was going to say, just in case anyone wonders why we kind of cut off for a second and suddenly you're puffed. So I want to go back. When I first met you, you told us the story of when you first met Brian Hurley. I'll be having Brian on hopefully next week at some point.
Outstanding.
So I can't wait to hear what he says about this story when he does hear it. But can you give us a bit of background about how you met him? I believe you met him at a competition, and I hope I'm quoting you correctly, where you said, I wanted to beat him so much that he never wanted to wrestle or fight me in any way ever again.
That's actually true. And it wasn't personal against Brian or Coach Brian, who became after that event, one of my most trusted friends and Team Takedown members, and he was a member for approximately 8 years until 2016 when he retired from the team and became valued alumni because of life reasons with his growing family. Rather, your anecdote and your memory is very accurate. Rather, my approach was always the coach Dan Gable approach, which was when you compete, we compete in such a way that your opponents never forget you, that you crush them, that you punish them, that you make them remember you, that because in wrestling, of course, we win a match by pinning our opponent's shoulders on the mat, and a lot of the time we'll get a takedown that doesn't give us. You can win on a superiority if you get a certain number of points. A lot of the time we'll get a takedown and it'll be a bit of a scramble, and you can cause pain. You can't submit, yet you can cause pain to your opponent by holding them or gut wrenching them in a certain way that they submit themselves, as in they pin themselves. And so my approach to wrestling was always about creating as much pressure, as much pain, as much discomfort, being as fit as I can be. That back when I was wrestling was 3 2-minute rounds. Now it's 2 3-minute rounds. That at the end of every break, my opponent would look across at me and I would be standing up sprinting on the spot, and I'd sprint back in the middle before the referee said time, whereas they were sitting on their chair drinking and
getting as much time as they can.
And so I would do everything I could to break my opponent. Now, coming all the way back to Brian, and I need you to ask Brian his perspective of this. I was competing in it was approximately probably about 2006, to be honest. It was a no-gi submission event run by Machado Jiu Jitsu in Richmond, and it was in the advanced division. And I shook Brian's hands, and he proceeded to pull guard on me, and I probably treated it with the disdain that.
For those that don't know, the guard pulling for you is like, I don't know, kicking a puppy or something. It's like one of the worst acts that a human being can do.
Indeed, and as a vegan, I think that's probably the best example of how underwhelmed I was by that. And so I think I just kind of walked off and did a little circle and came back again, and we hand fought for a little bit. And then amazingly, Brian shot on me, and he'd never done wrestling. So he shot on me, and I dropped my then 86 kilos and I'd just come back from the Oceania Wrestling Championships. I was super fit and conditioned, and I dropped everything I could and on my lead hip on his neck, and then proceeded to pass his half guard, put him into a cradle, put a coach Eric Pawson neck crank on him, look up at the referee, who was the Reverend, he was I forgot his name on that, which is horrible.
I'm sure I'll come back to you in a second.
A lovely chap, and asked him if neck cranks were legal, and he said no. So I turned it into a choke.
Was that like the cookie cutter?
Yeah, that's
type?
the one. And Brian tapped, and then pulled Brian up, hugged him, and we chatted afterwards. He asked what I did and where I was, and I invited him down to...
And a friendship was born.
A friendship was born from that moment.
Isn't that incredible? That's so funny, where you paused, not cranking, and basically just asked, am I allowed to do this? And then, no, I'll just quickly switch to this one here. That's
Thank you.
Unbelievable. But it's also, I spoke to... Because I went down to Perkins' open mat last week, and Brian was there.
Oh, fantastic.
We had a bit of a chat, and I can't remember exactly what it was. It wasn't a knee ride, but it was probably something similar, where he was putting his elbow directly into my solar plexus, mostly to get a reaction out of me, which sounds like what's the intent of wrestling as well. It's not to inflict pain for the sake of pain's sake.
It's to create a reaction.
And typically the reaction is to put
to pin themselves. Yeah, absolutely. So we're not allowed to submit. However, I can crank you or torque you in such a way that your only escape is to put your shoulders on the back, on the mat, and people will do that.
Yeah. There we go.
Now, please,
great story.
please ask Brian his perspective of the story. I'd love to hear it.
I can't wait. That'll be great for him to be able to tell us a little bit more about that. So let's switch it up, and I want to talk about your book, if possible. So Wrestling with Resilience, which you sent me a copy of. So thanks very much for that.
My pleasure.
So first of all, your motto, impose your will. Love it. First of all, it's stuck with me, even if I hadn't met you any day or spoken to you or seen any Facebook posts after the intent of it when you came down to Perkins Jiu-Jitsu and kind of imposing your will on the other person has stuck through me. And I think it's obviously a wrestling focused thing, but it's got so many other applications.
Indeed. In fact, your listeners may discern that over the journey that we're discussing in my history, I've evolved in my approach to coaching and even my own participation in the motto "Impose Your Will," which I adopted for our team at its formation in 2006. Initially was, as you quite rightly recalled, Cam, for you as a competitor to impose your will against your opponent. So no matter who comes across the cage or the mat or the ring, and I used to say back in the day, it could be Fedor Emelianenko or Chris Cyborg. Chris Cyborg's still apt, by the way, coming across the cage or ring towards you, that you're going to impose your will against him or her. Now it's about impose your will on life.
Yeah.
Whether it be your studies or your family challenges or your work or whatever it may be, whatever adversity we face, impose your will on that difficulty.
And I think just bringing in Chris Cyborg, bringing back a memory, Fiona Muxlow with her Invicta,
very good.
When she was fighting against Chris Cyborg.
Yeah.
And although it was a loss, the intent of her takedown and just going for it as hard as you possibly could, she lived that.
Absolutely. And in fact, if you look at the footage, you'll see Fiona entering the Invicta cage in Kansas City, followed by her entourage, including me, who you can see my hands holding up her poster, and then just Fiona's steely will. Now, history will say that she took a loss, and it was stopped by referee Big John McCarthy quite rightly in the first round. Yet she did everything possible. We took the fight at short notice. Fiona was brave when others weren't willing to fight.
Yep.
Cyborg coming off the ped suspension at 145 pounds. We took it at short notice. Fiona went across and trained at Tiger Muay Thai and prepared herself as best she could. Now, history will say that she took a loss, yet she did everything within her power.
And I suppose circumstantially as well, she was fighting arguably one of the best women fighters in the world.
Take away women. One of the best fighters
correct.
in the world.
Correct.
In history. And Cyborg's only had, Chris Justina, she's only had one loss. And that was her first competition. You know. She's an outstanding combatant who is still competing in 2018 and is defending her title against Amanda Nunes this December.
Yeah. So it just shows the peak physical fitness that she would have had even back then as well.
Indeed.
And now, obviously. But
And Fiona's a perfect exponent, and I'm very proud for Fiona to be a member of Team Takedown.
Perfect. So in terms of your book, Wrestling with Resilience,
Yes,
I'm only about halfway through it, I confess. Do you want to talk a little bit about it? I think it came out about a year ago, is that right?
Thank you. We launched it in November last year at the Melbourne Sports Writers Festival. It's a handbook for the reader to develop his or her resilience and mental toughness through self-directed activities as you work through the handbook. So it's literally a handbook. Initially, it was written because over certainly the last 5 or 6 years, but over my whole journey as a psychologist, at the end of each session, my patients would ask me for tools or resources, and I would be madly writing down for them the recommended activities or resources or support depending on their particular
circumstances.
Correct, very good. And what I found is I was writing a lot of the same things.
Yep.
And then I thought, wouldn't it be great, Cam, if I had one handbook or one resource that I could provide to people? And so I mentioned that to, at that stage, my very good friend, who has since become my PhD supervisor, Associate Professor Simon Moss, fellow psychologist. And he actually said, there's a book in this. We could actually put together a book, and that could form your PhD research, which is investigating strategies and techniques to build resilience in individuals facing difficult stressors.
And it sounds like as well, you didn't specifically mention this, but it's resilience through self-awareness as well.
Oh, absolutely.
But also from a future perspective, and there was a quote that I was just looking up while you were talking then, a dream written down with a date becomes a goal broken down into steps becomes a plan backed by action becomes reality. And that book that you've actually written up is essentially you writing down your goals, setting plans, setting times, setting what the limitations or potential blockages would actually be, and then working towards it, as opposed to just having this dream which is kind of insubstantial and sort of not actually having any I don't know, it feels like it's almost like unattainable.
Yeah. Thank you. And that's a very evocative poem or quotation. Certainly, I've endeavoured to do that, and I can attest with quiet glee that the book has been extremely well received, particularly as a handbook for resilience training. So I've delivered. I'm blessed to be able to deliver many training workshops to organisations, to various populations, from office workers all the way through to athletes such as my footballers, through to martial artists, through to emergency service personnel and military and law enforcement, using the handbook as a guide. I also do quite a lot of work in mental health, Cam, and we just have 3 or so weeks ago come off Are You OK Day as a mental health initiative.
I post that you popped up about that.
Which was my busiest day of the year because I was flipping from venue to venue giving mental health talks. And I use several of the techniques from my book to help create and maintain mental health.
Yeah, and I think your mental toughness comes through in the way that you actually speak and the kind of fluency of your thoughts as well, because obviously it's not just something where you're just making up as you go along. You've actually thoughtfully, mindfully thought, I suppose.
Indeed, in fact, I have a program in my resilience training which is represented by the handbook, which is firstly all based on empirical research, and secondly progressively flows. So you mentioned very kindly that you're halfway through your book. You'll notice that the techniques and strategies and activities progress from the self-awareness in Unit 2 through to more than rating yourself on qualities and characteristics of high achievers and derailers, all the way through to Unit 4, which is, well, these are our practical strategies to build resilience and mental toughness.
I do actually appreciate as well, when you're actually reading through the book and you have a particular, did you know kind of quote, it does have the scientific backing all there, so it's all scientifically backed information.
Absolutely, and
that's quite important.
Thank you for noting. Kaboom! Thank you for noting that, because myself and Associate Professor Moss were adamant to our publisher that we wanted to include the citations for the research, and then to list all the research, so that particularly in 2018, where people want knowledge, so they can go off and read the actual empirical articles or the chapters, and it also then stood the handbook apart from the self-help tomes and journals and books and websites that are available that are well-intentioned yet not always mired in empirical research.
Yeah, I think also if you just had the reference at the back of the book without any kind of in-text references, it may have been either difficult to be able to find the specific fact that you're referring to. So just even from like a administrative perspective, it would have been difficult. But I just also think it kind of lends a bit of weight or authority to whatever the particular lesson is that you're trying to teach. It's fantastic. It's really good. Again, I haven't gone through it all yet. I think I got up to the part where I'm reading my qualities, but I haven't gotten to it.
Very good.
I haven't gone past there.
Very
it's
good.
Fantastic.
Are you eating your breakfast with your non-preferred hand yet?
Not yet. So that was about eating, doing something difficult every day.
Yeah.
3 things difficult?
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah, very good.
I haven't started. I don't have breakfast though.
Well, please, as a coach, please introduce having breakfast for a start, and then do it differently.
Yeah, but I think, I don't know whether you're familiar with David Goggins.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm starting to get obsessed with him ever since he was on the Joe Rogan Experience, and just seeing his mental toughness and the fortitude that he's built, and about doing a difficult thing every single day. I haven't started yet, but the intent of it is just phenomenal. And I suppose it's almost like making that switch where you feel motivated for now, but then the next day it's sort of like, are you actually going to act on any of the stuff that's motivating you, or are you just going to say it gives me that warm fuzzy feeling, it'd be great if I could do that, as opposed to actually doing it?
Indeed.
Yeah, so it'll be very interesting. Distribution of the book. How can actually people get a copy of it?
Thank you so much for asking. The book is available in store and online at the Brunswick Street Bookstore.
Yep.
www.brunswickstreetbookstore.com.au, I believe, or there might not be an AU. But yeah, just Google Brunswick Street Bookstore and Wrestling with Resilience, and you'll be able to purchase it there.
Can you get it online through Brunswick?
Yeah, correct.
I'll put a link to it in the podcast description as well.
Thank you. That's very generous.
Is there anything else particularly on the book that you want to kind of promote on that?
No, in fact, I appreciate the opportunity just to speak. I do believe that it's a useful tool to guide the development of resilience and mental toughness in a progressive manner.
Yeah.
So particularly for your listeners, for a jiu-jitsu competitor or a mixed martial arts competitor or a coach, I do believe it has great value and use for reading through and working through the activities.
I think even just outside of that, to be honest.
Absolutely.
If anyone is listening and they haven't mindfully looked at their previous experiences and made a mindful self-awareness kind of exercise where you actually write down your past experiences, how they've shaped you. I think for anyone who knows Jordan Peterson and the self-authoring program, it's very similar to that. Highly recommend it regardless of whether you're jiu-jitsu, MMA or anything. So yeah, if anyone wants to have a look at it, I can take a few photos or something like that. I don't want to give away the actual content unless you're comfortable with it, Chris, but I can maybe even just show a version of it or something like that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Fantastic. All right. Is there anything else you want to kind of touch base on?
Once again, thank you so much for inviting me.
Thanks for having me down. I know it's obviously invitation only, so
my pleasure. Secondly, good luck with your podcast series. I look forward to be able to proudly say that I knew Cam when, and I was one of the first guests, as now you fight Joe Rogan for popularity as a podcast.
I'm definitely going to get up there, definitely.
Down the track. And thirdly, please come and visit again, because what we might want to do in future is I can take your listeners through specific techniques.
That would be fantastic. I mean, it's almost a little bit of a selfish thing that I'm doing here, because I get to just meet really interesting people so it's almost a bit selfish of me to kind of be able to do this podcast. But yeah, I'd love to come back. I'll have you on as a return guest anytime.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Fist bump. One last one.
Kaboom! Kaboom! Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks again for listening, everyone. This podcast is just getting off the ground, so if you liked what you heard, please consider rating us on iTunes, liking our Facebook page, or subscribing on YouTube. And if you've got any other comments or suggestions for future episodes, please feel free to post me up on the Facebook page, and we'll try to incorporate people's feedback.